with Ryan McGrath's, a former acquaintance, with whom I recently parted. Recent rambling contribution on NAWALTS, an acronym standing for Not All Women Are Like That, though, following titular grammatical rules, it should be NAWALT. But I digress. I thought I'd take this opportunity to address the arguments, textbook and quite stock fare, really, brought up by one of the moderate commenters, who had flooded in like a bad flash monsoon during Ryan's commentary on the advent of Reggie Yates coverage for the BBC about non-existent anti-homosexual persecution in Russia as part of a continuing series that, above all else, glorifies normal-fag transsexuals, for whom I have no sympathy, seeing as their provision is at the expense of autistic suppression and denial, among other things. Today, I'm just here to drench my underused mop with the blood of moderate feminist hubris. Shall we begin? Tamstoon is one commenter who I'll draw attention to as the primary source for the usual stock arguments, not because they're necessarily more easily debunked than the likes of the main shitposter in it. I've forgotten already its name, but as a matter of their more cohesively collated nature, even if that's the only thing which can be remarked coherent about their otherwise incoherent ramble. Although they have remarked, and perhaps correctly, that Ryan's piece is something of a ramble, for them to then proclaim it's not a sensible conversation of the issue arrogantly places their subsequent set of unsubstantiated claims at an undue place of sensibility which, as we shall see, has far from any foundation. They claim that I understand how some men might feel suppressed by feminism. That's putting it fairly lightly, and they also make sure not to append appropriate auxiliary context so as to distract away from the reality that this was their intention all along, one's attention to a non-existent inadvertency of the situation, as if they are to be somehow absolved of blame. No, that's not flying, first and foremost. They then complain that the definition of feminism is at fault as a concept, to proceed in giving their own, watered-down, reptilianly misrepresented reflection of the ideology's claims, as if to forge a less maliciously indicting sort of innocent strawman to act as an alibi for their real intentions, as ever, of course. They are, effectively at this juncture, admitting to wanting a redefinition of the concept fit for public consumption, so as to take advantage of the socially situated mindlessness thereof, in thwarting its further investigation. They have the arrogance to expertly capitalize on an unprecedentedly mass-disseminated ignorance on the issue as has been foisted by the higher education institutions, in issuing the axiomatic diktat of equality as per usual, that this is the sole focus of the ideology. Never mind that it has been repeatedly attested by their radical and TERF forebears and compatriots, that they derisively regard the franchise of egalitarianism a concern only fit for masculinist renegades of the ideology, a status of which they relegate to an inferiority all unto its own, as sexually inferior made autistics, and other such contemptuous aspersions. It would be coincidentally true in Ryan's case, and he certainly has been pursuing MGTOW for all of the wrong reasons. He's a socially retarded autistic, suffering socio-economically of intellectually borderline retardation confined pauperism, has been outed of the dating market literally for waiting too long to advance rather than any truly sustained repeated rejection, is too concretely thinking, congenitally ugly and easily embarrassed to engage in insincere transgenderism emulation attempts to circumvent this matriarchal marginalization, etc., etc., but this notwithstanding that equality is considered by their ilk to be a masculinist enterprise, is frankly not all that surprising by any means. We'll get to a moment about how female oppression is by and large a mythological construct, born of historical revisionism. But it is generally regarded that men are more philanthropic, in that not only do they still have greater resources to do so at the upper end of the economic periphery, even if their average wealth, when discounting this elite, has seen an atrocious lagging behind unmeritocratically anointed women, but, as I've discussed of their empathetic style, combined with a greater likelihood within a man's lifetime to experience extreme mobilizations in class status, whether upwards or downwards, or, as in the case of my argument, both at different periods of life, a man just knows more so what it's like to be downtrodden and hard done by than a woman ever could, the latter ever buoyed by welfare, usually involving the anchoring of their children as collateral to procure it, of various forms, and an eclectic array of hypergamic opportunism ventures to choose from. Men just simply don't have those options at their disposal as expected providers. It quite elementarily makes no evolutionary sense to expect them to be less emotionally vulnerable or empathetic. High investment, that is K-selected, eugenic payoffs, will have been towards men, seeing as they were demanded of their dependability, since inferior women climb up the hypergamic ladder further than superior women, one relative to the male partners they predate upon, who often curb their own reproduction by choice. Females are genetically tending towards our selection, or, to put another way, high energy, anti-socially primal viciousness, let alone more like predators in their selection, given that it is predicated on being prey that one can be depended upon. One bearing in mind that I mentioned according patterns of superior women relative to their inferior counterparts are less hypergamic in form. They still are. Overall, a lot of this is that they just don't have further to ascend. A near universal rule, however, still has the strangest of home truthful exceptions. My mother is the only one of these to this rule that I know of, to personally experienced wit. Born into the family of an upper-middle-class small store chain-owning businessman, she only emerges half a century later to be hopelessly confined to lumpen proletarian destitution. No less how part of it was her fault. If it wasn't enough that the moderate feminist uses every mentally acrobatic trick in the book to admonish and excuse itself incessantly of any all-and-sundry transgression, then you might find their historical revisionism amusing, but not before we continue with our investigation into their forays in deflecting the burden of certain societal phenomena away from themselves. The militant and aggressive feminist, seeing as they are obsessed with denying the existence of a radically self-identifying contingent in a desperation to engage in reputational redemption, is always the recourse made, conveniently serving as the scapegoat for what is a wider phenomenon much more pervasive and inherent to their global ideological goals. Seeing an intellectual weakness in this particular commenter, it would almost be cruel to engage in the lowest blow, were it not called for by the occurrence of such an argument's use, but indeed, fallacious are anecdotal claims. "I'm not a man-hater" is not a statement of absolute, widely spread impertinence, which freshly baptizes the original sins of the ideology's ills. It could only fail to do so, for it speaks only for the claimant. Yes, it is a low blow, because there was the potential for a much more profound revelation to be made, were the person I was critiquing much more adroit in their significance, but alas, I can only expect as much from the peanut gallery of modern British higher education campuses, most of which are ex-further education polytechnics anyway. Misandry is a concept. It didn't strike in my spell checker as wrong, which is a good sign of it passing a test of conventionality, though this appeal to popularity would be in itself fallacious, so let me move on to something more substantive in its rationalization. Though first, allow me an anecdote. In my upper set English class, yes, even autistic retards like myself can do at least temporarily well in mainstream education, given the right opportunities, like the last years of stability in my household before it all collapsed to asunder in 2007. My teacher remarked saliently in his usual sermon-like style the nature of misogyny. He was probably what I'd call being on the periphery of moderate feminism, even if it didn't take his interest much further beyond virtue signaling. But sexual chauvinism, as is only natural to circumstance, as in not socially contrived, took precedence if only for the most rational of fears. Anyone driven by the spite of a chip on their shoulder, such as feminism encourages of women, are apt to turn it around on their former tormentors, in this case, entirely perceived ones. He had asked, "We know from the word root genus in misogyny that this stands for hatred of woman, and from the root anthros in misanthropy that this stands for hatred of humanity, but why isn't there an equivalent for that against men?" Somebody did answer, actually. The exact words used elude me, but it most veritably was the first instance, although unknowingly as to context, of my exposure to the word misandry. But my English teacher would proceed to reprimand his neologistic construct, as it was deemed by him. That was just a decade ago, in a Scottish state secondary school, and although we're far from progressive in all honesty, and certainly lagged behind on this measure as recently as then, I could have only imagined that the public elsewhere in the Anglosphere would have been similarly impuzzled around this same era. We've certainly, as a world less than a parochial entity, seeing as the world outside of the internet, in its retrograde nature, can be ignored but an illusion of antiquity and latency and adaptability to change, gone far in our exposure of feminist hypocrisies, that such a term has been given any widely disseminated verbal currency at all. Nevertheless, it is to erode away in the tacit expositions of feminist rhetoric, in the malign intentional secrecy concealed by the airs of due consideration and affected, though barely convincing, compassion. Chauvinism is inherent to sexes despite the intrasexual competition hypothesis, the latter which primarily, in the main, applies only to women. The female sort is infinitely more atomistic, however. It is continuously striving for its own subversion so that it can remerge a new or re-architecturally imagined state. This kind of desire to see its oligarchization into a hierarchically up-stratifying into the ranks most consumed by itself, we see, has been a historically established tendency since the island of Lesbos, with the sapphics not doing much in the way of mitigation of the inevitably emergent victors, a vicious class most analogous to the modern-day Olgak. Put in so many words, women found a way to oppress and undermine themselves most satisfactorily before any other infiltrating influence had ever come to make its appearance onto the scene. Then, the first radical feminist experiment in the history of man had evolved into orgiastic prurience. You might recall my old writings in 2013 about their tendency towards coprophagia, and as my first mentor, Grace Bartholomew N.E. David Shack, an Aspergian American libertarian nationalist philosopher with a decency in grounding of Freudian dynamics to surmise what follows thus, once said, they eat shit because they are shit. Before collapsing entirely under the weight and in refusal to pull their own of their dead collectivism. Men are apparently excluded from the history of oppression categorically and unequivocally. In reality, the resurgence of traditional decorum had taken a different fashion without any necessarily implied misogynistic bent only. In the last couple of hundred of years, with the rise of urbanity, it is only essentially in accordance with a return to proto-evolutionary roles, as is the case in the adaptation to any new environment. Prior to industrialization, women and men, for the largest part, suffered an equal spread of disprivilege and privilege, if the latter, and usually exclusively, towards the end of the elite, were just naturally more interested in pursuing the customary studies of court fare per European aristocratic custom. The appeal to nature argumentation, in fact less fallacious than on first impression, may seem like a weakness when one tries to discard it entirely out of hand in the sociological prism of a demagoguery pervasive to British higher education, and if this Neoplatonism has you duped to uncriticality such that any sweepingly generalizing rejection of the rather highly intricate processes of nature is, then I can assist you here, my apologies. However, the literature is far from out. The jury returned with a verdict ages ago that evolution is indeed guilty for forging the majority of sex differences. There was no specific prescription upon women placed against their learning to the degree that they, in their new position as a psychopedagogue superclass, overdiagnose autism and retardation in males to confine them a life of specially miseducated drudgery today. Speaking about oppression's relative privation, whether in terms of the latitudinality of its extension, you can't be, because I am a, special snowflake or the extent to which freedom is curtailed in contingency Ferrito. You hadn't had X done to you, though you had Y done to you. It's not as bad as the Z done to me, etc., is an invitation to suspicion in the credulity of such a position's presentation as lacking conflicted interest. It most certainly is, in that case, suggestive of a particularly vested one on the part of the proclaimed oppressed. Notice that I said in contingency Ferrito, pointing out that feminist agitators have been more active in their pollution of pedagogy and psychiatry to proliferate the spread of autistic overpathogenesis is in the statement of comparison, but one of current events. When considering this, a historical basis for the occurrence of the aforementioned phenomena is specious at best and absolutely ablatively attrition at worst, or in the proletarian's customary colloquial vernacular, blown out of water. Since, as Kim Jong-il observed in Socialism is a Science, that history's revolutionarily based reformations are born out of a popular motive forces demand, and further, that I still, in Spurgeon Socialism is a Science, fairly Ursitson and showed in its formation, even if in derivation, a work solidly of the former's inspiration, reason that, under the guise of Hegelian dialecticism, that synthetics, synthesis, in the thetical-antithetical paradigm, are the ultimate theoretical remergers and actually constitute exchanges of totalitarianities to a mere usurper proclaiming tutelage under minoritarian demand. We can say that a demand for female rights agitation propagandization only holds under the auspices of contrived revolutionary shifts emerging from contradictory forces that were conveniently united under their auspices. Women's rights organizations are thus merely but subversive entities, not natural, grassroots establishments. It is the last installment of this particular series, one which I rushed through cursorily, as I shouldn't have to address every single quotidian concern, criticism and contention of an extremely vapid ideology that only seems to have sought to seek converts to the covenant from a previous one of holy matrimonical leverage, rooted in Christian traditionalism. Yes, covert genocentric rule has existed since the Levite, as any decent and inquiring mind into the subliminalities and rejecting the conventional givens of the world knows. Thus traditionalism remerges anew. Doctrine-sanctioned democracy merely gives way to an impasse, one of permanently popularized, agit-propped, democratic demand and contrivance. The moderate feminist will always try to proclaim the voice of reconciliation, to the degree where, under the pretense of alliance, it will actively forge its own infiltrationist intrusion into all aspects of the masculine, from that slander to the condition of autism, by its diagnostic apparatus, to that actually conducted against the organized backlash against institutionalized feminist piety, by the treacherous, themselves moderate, themselves too conciliatory MRA, should I just say, MRA, small g, since these are heretics anyway, fifth columns, themselves Trotskyist invitations to capitulation. When arguing of the right for male rights activists to exist, they only argue for it in context of a continued franchise in the fight against misogyny. Talk about spreading your missionary emissaries too far. What concern does misogyny have for mankind? That is, beyond our recognition of its non-status as an entity and a hypothesis of female hysteria used violently against its opponents, with all the incredible childishness of a fallacy, yet simultaneous acceptance of toxic enablers? To the extent misogynists exist, allow me to make a few minimal recognitions. Yes, it was presumed an 8-point difference in it meant incorrigible retardation on the part of the female means for women are generally regarded as lying in the mid-90s and for men in the mid-100s. Part of this was complete innocence. Females are guilty of acquiescing to a role for which we had no finer tests to disprove the suitability thereof. Nevertheless, these gross presumptions were obviously never true on many measures and with respect to the accomplishments that would follow once female education was emphasized. But it was never prohibited, and it makes me rile with proper indignation when they try to proclaim any prohibition against them existed, when this is what they're doing against the autist right now. An 8-point difference in it is what it is, at 1/2 a standard deviation that doesn't make a terrible functional difference. On a comparison of European societies, this is equivalent to the difference in average IQs between former Yugoslavia, particularly the better republics, Serbia, etc., and the United Kingdom or the Netherlands. About 92 and 100 respectively. In the 1980s both had very similar standards of living, when discounting everything outside in-kind benefits etc., extraneous disposables, not requisite to livelihood. It's about the difference between those with Asperger's syndrome and those who are neurotypical, on G-loaded tests theorized as requiring corpus callosum activity such as scanning. Both means, for which are still well within average ranges, it was something like 94 and 102 respectively, last I checked. East Asians, despite outspring white societies, I doubt as much, 106 versus tilde 98, with great bias away from verbal and towards performance, reached a peak of economic development much earlier, despite rapidly developing the equivalent of 300 years of industrial civilization in less than a generation. When given the correct foundations and opportunity to research the rest on their own from scratch, their GDP PCS have stagnated at about $20,000, $25,000, whilst the white worlds are still growing, averaging $37,000, $50,000. This has solid theories in verbal IQ, economic development limitation factors. It's really nothing to do with how well or fast you think. Verbal reasoning is a limiter of acculturation, without which no further sophistication of society is possible. It's one of the main reasons, in my opinion, why a radical feminist society would fail. Women are just too superficial. They think so fast as for everything to be overprocessed. Half of their speech patterns are platitudes and cliches. Verbal spontaneity, contrary to the delusions of Temple Grandin's mother, in which she wrote on an essay one time of autistic infantilistic pedophilic translations. Put simply, the autists are future child rapists. It's hilariously insensitive, only comes with a contingency of emotional crassness. If it can be inspired by the demonically begrudged, then they'll think it, otherwise they don't care. Hell, quite frankly, on that measure, an isolated, enclosed, secretive, dictatorial civilization of Asperger males would probably last longer without collapsing, even if it would be a major human rights abuse that our elite would rightfully ignore. You need better reasoning rubrics than feel guilty for my emotional manipulation tactics to elicit loyalty, hence why artificially psychotic, drug-addicted autists were the arbiters of religious scholastics for the longest period. Comparative sexually dimorphistic biology aside, which I really didn't want to go into and instead just slipped into the opportunity for tangential occurrence, let's return to those contentions of our feminist counterparts so pertinent. Feminists speak of misogyny having the target of male weaknesses as well as themselves. This is a claim evidently rooted in projection and derision. Nobody had actually considered it weak for a male to occasionally express their emotional sentiments. It was an inherent demand for a man to keep their pride and breakage thereof private, since traditional society predicated itself on not exhibiting its subversive cultural phenomena, including expressions of the psychodynamically errant. That is, until they came along, partnering with various academics including Heidrich Y.H.W.H. Priest down in Cambridge's A.R.C. and his vowel-less, autistopathic spittle, silently concealing the desire to shove the dagger into Goyim's mankind. Spreading the ubiquity of male weakness has been an obsessive feminist domination fetish of their ilk. Latex and wrapped gloves concealing, fisted wrists penetrating areas of their personifically represented patriarchy that I'd rather not concern myself with, probably has all manner of their duration evoked in those regions of anatomy analogous to the might again, similarly, prefer not to mention. Yes, I'm quite weak, stomach today compared to others. But it doesn't reflect the reality beyond that auto-fetishistically imagined of their desires, which translates into an openly expressed but secretively mocking concern with the same elements: crypto-homophobic, crypto-transphobic, fuck it, everything phobic. I mean, they're as well to put bleach in their autistic kids' food. They're about as socially toxic anyway. Highly encoded sentiments of prudish disgust are merely transposed through a rhetoric of protectionism. Contempt becomes saviorship. The cry of the Munchausen. Feminism is not a conversation. It is moral doctrine, disguised as an ideological framework of analysis. Something lending itself to analysis must have a falsifiability inherent in its confines, but when a feminist deploys a factoid, they treat it with a sacrosanctitude of Levitical gospel, and it is about as prescriptive in permitted activities. Consensual sex becomes rape. I can walk past by some female children, but not male ones, because who gives a shit? And I'm automatically cognitively associated a pedophile by the subliminal messages of their impartment onto the public. I can breathe about a yard from a little girl and it's already deemed a form of telekinetic misogyny because I'm stealing the matriarchy's precious oxygen. How can you converse with these extreme positions reasonably when they are not predicated on anything but the furthest extension of strict dichotomic arbitration? As it is often remarked by the Jew themselves, what's good for us is bad, that must be done unto the goyim. So I'm further convinced that womanhood's only considered position for mankind is as Khmer Rouge-style disembodied skull cobblestones. Let them have those, I say. I want feminism to prove its brutality in the coming decades as far as possible so that the backlash can most appropriately take form.